So today's session, I'm super excited to be here to be facilitating this session. I'm not sure who came up with the idea, but it's a really cool idea, I think, to visualise the systems that we work in as sort of, so if we think about that as the board, and then we have snakes and ladders. We have within a system the ability to further entrench people in disadvantage or to enable people to overcome that disadvantage. I think it was incredibly moving to hear Essie's story this morning as a scene setter for this conversation, because, you know, her strength, her intelligence, her human spirit's just so clear. And I think if when we talk about these things, we need to be talking about how we empower people to overcome the disadvantage that they're born into, but recognising that people themselves have that power within them, and our system needs to recognise and empower people themselves. I'm thrilled to be facilitating this conversation because, for many reasons, but one of them is because QCOSS is doing a lot of work in this area at the moment. People who have come to this forum before would have heard me talk about the Town of Nowhere campaign, which was a campaign we ran for a number of years in response to the housing crisis. We determined to do a campaign when we're hearing really strong themes from our members about issues that they're really concerned about. In the last 3 years in particular, we've been hearing more and more from community organisations the reflection that we're not, as a system, properly ensuring equity of access for disadvantaged families with children, and in particular access to health, education and housing as real enablers for the quality of life we all deserve to have. We did some research across the last few months. We commissioned the University of Queensland, Professor Karen Healy and her team, to work with about 100 stakeholders across Queensland to come up with some practical solutions about how we address the disadvantage that we're seeing. And we're going to be releasing a report about that research soon called Raising Queensland. But I'm joined on the panel today with some extraordinary people who also have a great contribution to this conversation. And I'm going to throw to you first, Fiona. I'm keen to hear your perspective about why do we have systems that do trap people in cycles of disadvantage?
Thanks, Aimee. And hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I think some of my reflections started to, I would say, expand, because examining just the number of people with evident complex needs and great vulnerabilities in the homelessness sector, with a surging demand towards high subsidy types of housing, I realised from, expanding my view that the correlation between adverse childhood experiences, including poverty, including violence, parents incarcerated, parents with drug and alcohol challenges, mental health challenges. It's worth reading about ACEs, but when you look at that, it's like 54% of people with very vulnerable homelessness as adults have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, compared to only 3 to 5% of the general population. So it made me start to think about what is underpinning all of this, and I definitely think that there is a structural level of poverty that's affecting some people intergenerationally in a way that we are not impacting at all, really. I think we can talk about what prevention is, if we were to prevent poverty and exposure to adverse childhood experiences, and therefore reduce the number of people emerging into complex homelessness in later life, as well as child protection systems and criminal justice systems, youth justice systems. There's so much intersectionality. It would be underpinned by improved universal access to health and education as the starting point, where vulnerable families were identified early, and where the right kinds of intensity of integrated systems working to support those families to prevent that exposure to adverse childhood experiences. But our position at Q Shelter is that needs to be underpinned by a deliberate, intentional approach, intergovernmental, to embed a poverty reduction framework in Australia that is picked up by state governments and translates through to every single funded contract in our sector to be working relentlessly to fix systemic poverty and all of its representations in order to reduce the pipeline of people really emerging into these complex vulnerabilities that we really can't fix later in life. We can only really manage them. So our provocation is we I think, know what to do. We know we need to do better prevention and structural reform, but we don't know how to do it, and that's the conversation we really need to have.
Thanks, Fiona. So I think that's a really important way of beginning the conversation, is talking about sort of when people are children and at those early parts of our lives, making sure that we're talking about equity of access and not always from a prevention lens, because people are, we're not doing the thing because we want to prevent the harm from happening necessarily. We're doing the thing because everyone has a right to access these universal systems. If I can go to you, Sue, from a housing perspective in your work, I guess you're also seeing families who are trapped in this cycle of intergenerational trauma. What are you seeing in terms of some of those snakes or things that are actually leading to people being trapped?
Thanks, Aimee, and good morning, everybody. So some of the things really, Essie's talked about all of the things this morning. And I'm going to start with homelessness and housing instability. Moving house is really stressful for anyone. So when you have a family that's constantly moving and not really sure where they're moving to or when they have to move again, that's incredibly stressful, not just for the grown-ups but for the kids as well. And often that disrupts, all of the aspects of people's lives. We heard Essie talk about school, having to change school frequently, breaking your social supports, your family supports, and it's really expensive. And so we have some, I remember one family talking to me about the impact on their kids, moving houses constantly, just getting their kids to sleep through the night, getting settled in the house, feeling safe and comfortable in their new bedroom, and then they have to move house again, which means a whole nother intensive effort around working with that little one to get them feeling safe and comfortable enough to sleep through the night. Just one little example of how stressful that can be. And then your neighbours have a big impact on your life. So if you live in an area where there's a concentration of disadvantage, I've seen that particularly in the US, that can have a big impact on your ability to feel safe if you're exposed to crime and have fewer opportunities in your neighbourhood. And then, of course, if you experience discrimination, stigma, racism from the community and from the neighbours that you live in, that's an incredibly stressful and horrible feeling, because you can't feel safe and comfortable in your own home if you're experiencing those sorts of things. And I guess I wonder about, and I'm worried about all of the families that are the hundreds of families that are living in motels at the moment. Essie talked about that as well, and the impact that has on your health and well-being. And I wonder about those kids, what's going to happen to those kids when they grow up and become grown-ups and parents, what this early experience for them will mean for them as grown-ups. And we all know that homelessness is traumatising. So that has a very big impact as well on people's mental health and well-being. Low incomes, unstable employment, the difficulties juggling, raising a family, particularly if you're a single parent, single mum, juggling raising a family with employment. Limited access to early childhood is a super big issue, and it links in with employment opportunities for parents. And then the health disparities, and some of these health disparities can occur across generations. So chronic health conditions and poor mental health, and we know both of those things are often an outcome of homelessness or housing instability. And they can really trap families in particular in disadvantage. And trauma. So intergenerational trauma is something that's pretty broadly experienced by families in this situation, and that can be incredibly debilitating in terms of moving forward and working to bring up the family and have some stability in the family.
Cindy, I know as we're talking about all of this, it's surely resonating with you and your experience. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. My daughter and I left a relationship and we left from a police station with nothing but the clothes we were wearing. And we were, luckily, and I know it's weird to say this, but luckily we were only homeless for 2 months. And in that time, we reported another 1,800 breaches to our DVO. And trying to navigate that, I wish at that point I had actually known more about the services that were available. I wish the police had more knowledge of that, because they were the only people I was speaking to in the chaos of that trauma. So they didn't know all the resources that are available, so then we didn't. And I actually took us to stay with family, and that was another mistake because they added a whole new layer of trauma over it. They were not supportive. They were like, you can go back, Well, no, I can't. I'm sorry, we're inconveniencing you for 2 months, but no, we can't do that. But we had somewhere safe to come home to. It was my house. It's where I've lived for a long time. So my neighbours, they had their loyalty to me. And my kids, they would let us know if he was coming down the street from the other end. We'd get a message going, he's coming past, and we had blue tack on our curtains to our walls, and we were crawling around and we had no lights on. But having that stability of that community to come back to is what I kept fighting for, which is why I didn't realise until last time I was speaking on this forum that we were actually homeless for 2 months. I just thought we were away and fighting to get back. But it wasn't until I was on another forum that I was like, oh my God, I was literally homeless for 2 months with nothing. So, and the fight was real. Listening to my daughter, I suppose, had the biggest impact on me. While we're in hiding, I acknowledged to her that I felt unheard. I felt unheard, I felt unseen, I felt unsafe. And I could not imagine how much worse that was for her, because she was only 11, turning 12 during our experience. And I could not get my head around if I felt that way. She's just dragging in the wind behind me. This has got nothing to do with her, and she's having to go through this with me. So when we'd go to police stations to report all the breaches, I would censor myself because I didn't want to add to her trauma. Some of those things that he said and was going to do to me, she has still never heard, and she's 21 soon. And she never will, because she didn't feel safe enough on the other side of a closed door for me to be able to tell the story again and again and again and again and again. And that's where we need to start making these changes, where we've got safe places to disclose but not be told, you've got to tell us your whole story and then we can't help you, or you have to go on a waiting list, or this, and then they give you another number and another number and another number. And after about, the 50th time, you don't want to tell your story anymore. You don't want to keep repeating it because you're still living in it.
Yeah. I think, one of the things when we caught up before the session that really sort of landed with me is how inspiring it is how you've been able to experience what you've experienced and then draw from that insights and reflections about how things could have been different for you and your daughter, and then translated that into some action that you're taking to help others.
I think that came from the fact that I was raised to be tough. Like, I did martial arts for 17 years growing up. I thought I was never going to be in an abusive relationship. I thought, out of all the people on the planet, who's gonna be abusive to someone that's so ready to stand up for themselves? And you know what? It happens. And it happened out of nowhere. Like, you are so blinded by the abuse when it starts because you're like, hang on, this doesn't make sense. Like, how does this make sense? And then we're kind of programmed as women, especially, to go, okay, we need to fix this. We're fixers, you know, and we need to fix this. Okay, so that didn't work, so I'm going to try it different tomorrow, and then different. And then every time you try it differently, you're losing a step. So with this, we were like, no, we need to claim this back. You know, we need to do something with our pain. I needed to show my kids that bad stuff on a scale happens to everybody, but it's what you do with those experiences that makes the difference. And for a couple of years, my kids were both very angry at me for doing this because I was essentially keeping this experience in our lives. But as they got older, they both totally understand that what we're doing has value. We've actually helped over 3,500, actually we're up to over 4,100 kids in Logan with our comfort kits that we put in police stations, because every time I went to a police station, my daughter had nothing. So we've created these comfort kits with headphones and tablets in the police stations and, you know, colouring in books and kids' helpline cards and all the things that would have helped my daughter. And we've got an amazing community across Australia that actually, you know, crochet us toy snails and they go in the kits because our kids need something to hold going through that. And when you leave with nothing but the clothes on your back, your kids had nothing. If she'd had that, she would have had something that was hers from the very beginning of that experience to the end.
And Cindy, is that what the Love Bugs is about sort of responding to the experience people have when they're kind of engaging in the system in that crisis?
I'm hoping we're giving the parents the opportunity, like we're putting the child in a little bubble of love, and we're not silly. We understand that, you know, kids are always going to be a little bit tuned in, especially when they're in that fight and flight situations and when their trauma's right up, but it's going to dull that noise for them. They have the option then to tune in or out of the statements that are happening. And I can't stand to know that more kids are going through what my daughter went through because it had nothing to do with her. You know what I mean? She's an incidental victim, but the trauma is real, the impact is real. And as we get further away from the experience, the layer of trauma actually gets deeper because you actually stop and acknowledge it. So the further away we're getting, we're like, oh, look what trauma did to us. Oh, look what trauma did to us, you know? And on a good day, trauma made us funny.
Thank you for sharing all of that, and thank you for the amazing work that you're doing in the community, Cindy. Michael, I wanted to bring you in. I wanted to ask you, from your sort of research background, what does the evidence say about how we can start to transform systems to really empower families and to disrupt intergenerational disadvantage?
Well, what the evidence tells us is one of the greatest predictors of homelessness amongst adults is experiencing homelessness as a child. And roughly half the people who present to homelessness services had a parent who had been homeless as well, whether or not it was with the child. Particularly when it's the mother that's been homeless, there's a really strong correlation there. So there's a clear sort of echo and pattern that plays out, which is about the sort of cycles of poverty that Fiona referred to. And that's exactly the sort of framing we should be talking about. I mean, housing policy in Australia, there's a lot of debate around productivity, around supply. And yes, there is a truth to the need for more housing supply, but there's a much greater truth, I think, for the need for services that actually meet everyday families' needs. You know, the people who are suffering the most, we need to be focusing on that rather than some of the sort of productivity and large-scale economic issues. We need to be getting to the social issues that underpin all of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just about the houses, is it? It's about all of the things that we need to address to ensure people can also sustain their tenancy, but also have a good quality of life. Fiona, I'm sure you're aware of some programs, services, projects that sort of have worked, do work. Would you be able to talk a little bit about those?
I want to acknowledge so many of the people here will be running programs and services that are absolutely outstanding programs and services. But I think to go with Michael's comment about framing, it's really important that we think in the terminology that Aimee's used in terms of systems, and from the right design of systems, then we can define the policies with investment, and then define the program designs that underpin, the specifications that underpin all our funded services, flowing through to service delivery models, and also the wider community and all of the things that it can do to make a difference. There's two examples I want to give in the international context. One is Canada, that does have a poverty reduction plan. They have legislation that defines poverty, and it's a more elegant and I suppose, integrated definition of poverty, not just a certain percentage of people who are at a certain point in the income spectrum. It has got measures, and it's rigorously evaluated every year against indicators that show whether or not the poverty reduction measures that they have instigated are working. It is a critical role for national government, but also the provinces play a critical role as well, and then all of the funded services reaching out from that, and communities themselves. So I think we should look to Canada, but also, and that's only quite recent, only a few years ago was that put in place. In Ireland, there's been a poverty reduction plan since the 1990s. And again, I think it's now called a social inclusion strategy. But again, it is measured and monitored, and it is intersectorial, and it's integrated across levels of government and out into all of the different systems and assistance that people need. I don't think we should be trying to talk about prevention in terms of programs and services. I think we should be talking about prevention in terms of systems and driving a nationally coordinated approach in which we go as far as to legislate definitions and targets, and then we integrate all commissioning through all levels of government out to the community services sector to meet those targets. That's what I'd do.
Yeah, I love that sort of way of thinking about it. So we're thinking about disrupting disadvantage in an intergenerational sense. So not right in the moment, and not just for the next few years, but how do we change things for the generations to come? And what Fiona's talked about so eloquently is let's start at sort of the intention level, the systems level, where we say what it is that we're seeking to achieve, and be really clear around what we mean by poverty and what we mean by ending poverty, and then let's have an accountability framework. And then that then informs what do we do then in terms of policies, and even down into government then commissioning services or enabling programs to be delivered. So I might bring you in there, because you can talk from that experience of services and programs that really are disrupting intergenerational disadvantage.
Thanks, Aimee. So I wanted to talk about supportive housing as a response for families, and there's lots of conversations happening in Queensland at the moment about supportive housing, which is fantastic, but supportive housing is really important for not all families need supportive housing, but for a percentage of families, supportive housing will be something that will be really important and life-changing. So we deliver a supportive housing for families program, also called Keeping Families Together, which supports just 20 families at the moment, and provides housing stability and intensive family support. So that's a program that we deliver with Micah Projects. And it's designed particularly for families who've had experiences of homelessness, engagement with child protection, and have a range of other complex issues that they're dealing with, and have at least one child under the age of 5. And what we do is we head lease properties in the private rental market and provide that stable housing for families. while the MICA team is able to work with families and provide some really tailored support and interventions that meet the needs of the specific families that we're working with, and that's really important too. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, it's a really tailored approach. And it's had some really amazing outcomes for a small program we've been delivering for about 4 years. And UQ did an evaluation for us a couple of years ago and looked at the outcomes across 3 different areas. So housing housing access, child welfare and family wellbeing. And despite the difficulties of accessing and maintaining properties in the private rental market at the moment, the vast majority of our families have been in stable housing for more than 12 months, a lot more than 12 months. We've also found that the children's experiences have experienced improvements in participation in early childhood and developmental improvements, and particularly around access to developmental supports to support the kids and the families. Despite histories of engagement with child protection, there's also been really positive outcomes around child safety. Families have experienced improvements in child safety outcomes, and that's directly a result of the safety and stability that they've received, but also the support and advocacy around accessing all of those other systems, the NDIS system, the education system that families get in our Supportive Housing for Families program. And then finally, in terms of the family wellbeing measures, there were positive changes in feelings of safety and stability for the family, their desire to participate in education and employment, and also improved feelings of self-efficacy. So, as I said, we've been delivering this program for about 4 years. We've seen little kids grow, we've seen kids move into high school, we've even seen kids finish high school and go on to develop and identify their own goals that they're now working towards for their own lives. Some of our families we've been able to transition the head leases into their names, and they've taken over the head leases, which is massive in this current housing environment. And some families have moved into public housing properties and are able to sustain their own tenancies in public housing properties. But for a very large proportion of the families that we support in the Supportive Housing for Families program, they might never be able to sustain a tenancy on their own, so they'll always need that support as well as the stable housing. So I think that's really important to remember. And again, we've heard about the importance of long-term housing. So transitional housing, crisis accommodation, there's a place for that, but for families to really move forward, they need that long-term or permanent housing.
Can I ask you a follow-on question about that, Sue? Because I'm just thinking about like the common ground model versus a model where you've got families in the community, and in your common ground model, you know, you have the building, you're able to provide those long-term tenancies, you have more control over that security and safety element. I'm just wondering whether you could comment on, you use the language safety and security. I'm wondering, when the underpinning is reliance on the private rental market, are there things that we could be doing differently or better to support families living in the community in that way, but to really be providing greater levels of security and safety?
Yeah, one of the big issues with our program is the reliance on the private rental market. So expectations around property condition and neighbourhood fatigue are key issues in our program, and moving. So we very rarely get more than a 12-month lease, and then we have to move families, which is incredibly disruptive. So being able to offer more stable, more long-term... I mean, we house people, but it's just not the same house over the years. that is a big problem. Also, Aimee's alluded to the fact that there is a need for safety that goes beyond properties that we can provide in the private rental market in terms of physical safety that we can't provide at the moment, that we do provide at Brisbane Common Ground, for example. There is a very high proportion of our families who have had experiences of domestic and family violence historically and ongoing. So there is absolutely a need for a response. Doesn't need to be high density, but a response where we can provide a physical safety component for families. Super important. Even if it's not a physical security guard on a concierge desk, if there's two key access to the building, that provides a measure of psychological safety for people as well. So I think there's, it goes to everybody's different and everyone has different experiences and different needs. So we need to be able to respond and understand and respect that one size isn't going to fit everyone. We definitely need more supportive, much more supportive housing across Queensland. It needs to look different to suit the needs of all of the different needs of families.
Thanks for that, Sue. Cindy, I want to go back to you and talk about, in your you've done this incredible job of sort of taking your experience and then delivering a service that sort of tries to ensure that other kids that have experiences similar to your daughter's have a different experience. If you could go one step further and do something else that you think would be transformative for families experiencing intergenerational disadvantage, what would be the thing that you would love to see changed?
I would love to see trauma-trained teachers in school. So there is so many kids that are trying to deal with trauma from home that they have no control about. I think our schools need those trauma-trained teachers to help them, and I feel like we should be finding some way. I would not know the logistics of it, but finding some way to give our kids a safe space with a safe adult in schools where they can talk about how they feel without blowing up the family. Like, there's got to be some kind of level of mandatory reporting, but they also need a safe space where they can vent about how they feel about what's going on at home without worrying that they're blowing up the family and they're going to go home and make it worse. And I feel like we need to try and create a space for that to happen, because that's where our kids will be able to go, we know what's happening at home, we get it, we know your power in that though is nothing, and that's where a lot of the acting out, I suppose, and the poor decisions come from, because they're not heard. They don't feel heard. And they have no safe space without all these, the adults in their life will be like, if you say anything to anyone, da-da-da-da-da. But these kids need somewhere they can offload, somewhere safe, somewhere that is not going to blow up things worse for them.
Yeah, I love that reflection, because what it really makes super clear is when we're talking about intergenerational disadvantage or intergenerational homelessness, we're not just talking about building houses, we're actually talking about the individual experience and the experience children have, and how we need to pay attention to that, not in a siloed way, but in the way a person experiences a system, which is across many different areas, including education.
Yeah. Unfortunately, school just added another layer of trauma for my daughter when we came back, because she didn't feel like she fit in. She would come home and be so upset that people were whinging and bitching about their mum and dad's rules. Like, I had to do the dishes, and she's like, who cares? I'd do the dishes 400 times for you if I didn't have to experience this. It's not a problem. Dishes aren't a problem. Getting grounded for a weekend, not really a problem. But I think we need to create more safe spaces for our kids to be able to unload without another layer of fear and trauma being added to that for their family's sake. Because no matter what, our kids are thinking of our safety, whether they're involved in the violence or not. Our kids want to protect us. No matter how much we say to them, it's not your job. Our kids, like our young boys, are growing up throwing themselves at stepdads. I hear this story from young men all the time, you know. Oh, I've had to jump on my mum's boyfriend's back. I've had to do this. I've had to do that. It's not their job to protect us. And they need somewhere safe they can talk about this stuff. Hopefully that will help lessen that load for them and they'll grow up less hurt, because I totally believe hurt people hurt people.
Yeah. Thank you, Cindy. I might go to you, Michael, for you now have a magic wand. What is your one change you're going to make?
I get handed magic wands fairly regularly when I'm sitting on panels, and the one thing I want to do with magic wands is dispel the notion that a magic wand or a silver bullet will fix the housing challenges we have. They're magical items. They don't work. You know, it leads to magical thinking, leads to lazy thinking, that if we just did this one thing, it'd all be fine. There's a lot we need to do. We need to actually have a really coherent, coordinated approach with a number of different players involved. There's no one thing. So the closest I would get to a one thing is actually developing that coordinated approach. So let's have a national plan for how we address housing and homelessness in this country. We've never had that. That's extraordinary to me. We've never had a national plan that is agreed by federal and state governments on what we should be doing. Let's start there.
I think you just used your magic wand. And I think it does link into what you were saying as well, Fiona, about that higher level strategic kind of thinking and commitment across all levels of government. What would you like to see done differently? I know you've already spoken about this, but yeah.
Oh, look, definitely I think it needs a bold vision, and it needs leaders, and I don't mean leaders, elected leaders only. I mean people like all of us doing whatever we can from wherever we are to have a coherent ask of the national government to kind of lead us in an integrated approach to this. I do think that's important, and just cultivate and hold and exercise an extraordinarily bold vision in everything that you do, and reach beyond, designing fantastic programs like Common Ground. And Q Shelter has been a sustained campaigner for more common ground. So as we go, of course, we're going to campaign for really important programs that are proven to work, but use every ounce of our opportunities, our relationships, and our ability to have a vision and to create a future that doesn't exist yet. It can be different. It's just using absolutely every ounce of leadership in the room to ask for the right thing that would be the unifying framework in which we could operate to deliver genuine prevention, and see that measured over time so that we can recalibrate in real time to fix the things that aren't working and do more of the things that are.
That's a great point. There is a lot of leadership in the room, including our federal member for Brisbane, Cara Cook, at the front of the room. So I'm sure she's listening. Sue, can I give you the last word? What would you like to say about what we need to do to change things?
So I think at some point and I like that Fiona used the word recalibrate, because I think at some point governments need to be brave enough to recalibrate the way we fund services and the way we respond to homelessness. So there is a place for crisis accommodation, but people need permanent or long-term, whatever you want to call it, housing. And so I think we need to look at the investment that where we're putting our money, where we're investing our money, and we need to look at recalibrating and investing more heavily in permanent housing responses and less heavily in transitional and crisis responses. Because in this housing crisis, no one's transitioning anywhere. So I would like to see a recalibration of our funding into more permanent solutions for people.
I'm glad I gave you the last word, Sue. That's all we've got time for. Can we thank our amazing panellists, Cindy, Michael, Fiona and Sue?